And I got into a polite disagreement with a friend the other day who was trying to say, well, that General Kane, he tried to talk to the president about the limits of air power and all this sort of thing. I said, wait a minute. Anyone with any sense at all, any professional depth would have said, this is the dumbest idea possible. Mr. President, don't do this. This will wreck your presidency. We will waste time, money, and resources on a campaign we don't need to fight that we can't win, at least not exclusively with air and missile power. But he was an airman, remember? And every airman privately believes that they can ultimately replace everyone in the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. That all they need are airplanes and missiles, and they can do it all. So he wasn't about to say, no, I don't think we should do this. He may have said, we're going to have to, it's going to be tough, but we'll supply the target sets and see how this goes. It should never have started, Judge. It should never have occurred. And you saw this comment that I guess came out of CENTCOM headquarters. I think Larry was the first to, Larry Johnson was one of the first to break it, that, the CENTCOM commander was, and his J2, his intelligence officer, were looking for new, innovative ways to punish Iran.
There it is, creative and unconventional ideas. Admiral Cooper sent that to more than 100,000 members of the military.
I mean, if this is not amateur hour on steroids, I don't know what is. Remember, this was not a war that was forced on us. We initiated this at Israel's, insistence, obviously, and the Israel lobby. There's no question about that. But nevertheless, we initiated it. And now we're saying, gosh, we've run out of ideas, guys. We don't have any more good targets. What do you think we should do? This is insane.
Before discussing the outcome of the conflict, Colonel Douglas MacGregor makes his strongest claim of the entire interview. He argues the biggest mistake wasn't what happened during the war. It was the decision to start it in the first place. In his view, American leaders dramatically underestimated both the costs and Iran's ability to respond. That argument becomes the foundation for everything else he says.
Well, that's a loaded question, Judge. I can tell you when I was serving in the War Plans Division of the Army Staff back in the 90s, this would have been 1994 to 1995. At that point, we were supposed to be able to fight these two wars, and they changed it from simultaneously to near simultaneously. We went back up and presented a study that we'd done that said we needed 563,000 soldiers in the United States Army, in the regular Army, in order to fight these two near simultaneous conflicts. And we were told, well, you're not going to get those. You're only going to get 495,000.
Yeah.
So we said, well, if we don't have them on hand, it's going to be very difficult. Well, you have the National Guard. And we said, yeah, but it'll take 6 months to a year before the National Guard ramps up to the point where you can send them into action. We went through that during World War II and World War I. We're not going to be able to do that very well. They said, well, there's new technology coming, and that'll compensate for the lack of manpower. I guess what I'm trying to tell you is it was always a lie. We were never able to fight two wars near simultaneously, never. And so I think that's the first part of the question. Second part is what happened to the greatest that Trump talks about all the time. By the way, remember, he's also told us that he personally rebuilt it all during his first term, remember?
Right.
Which, of course, is complete and utter nonsense.
You were in the DOD for a while in his first term, am I right?
Yeah, and that was just complete nonsense. I think you simply have an example of a very large and expensive military establishment that over many, many years was reduced in size without making any accommodations with change that new technology, new forms of warfare required. And so it's a very wonderful, small but wonderful tribute to the armed forces of the Second World War and the Cold War. Nothing's changed. And it didn't really matter what we did in most cases when you were dealing with these smaller states where we chose to intervene. We were overwhelmingly powerful. There wasn't a great deal they could do about it. And I think they misjudged Iran. They thought they were dealing with another Iraq or Syria or Saudi Arabia or Libya. and they weren't. And they've gotten an education the hard way. And now, instead of recognizing the limits of our power and the prudent action that should be taken, which is to disengage and get out of this mess, I'm afraid we're doubling down on failure.
MacGregor begins by challenging a long-standing belief that the United States could decisively fight multiple major wars at once. He argues that confidence was built during conflicts against much weaker opponents, creating expectations that don't necessarily apply to today's strategic environment. Whether viewers agree or disagree, this sets up his broader criticism of recent policy.
I think there are two things happening, Judge. At least two main driving forces behind this mechanism. One is Israel and the Israel lobby and the people backing the Israel lobby who put Donald Trump into power with the expressed wish that he take on Iran and destroy it for Israel. Israel's hegemony, its supremacy in the region, cannot be established as long as there is a powerful Iranian state. They misled the president. They presented utter nonsense that he eagerly inhaled, and that's another story. But that's why we got into this to begin with. Now we're dealing with something else that I think affects probably President Trump and probably also President or Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's what I call the gambler's fallacy. If I can just roll one more time, I know I've won before, I can win again. I know this will work. And we are also watching as large numbers of aircraft are being sent back to the theater. And I think before long, we're going to find out that every B-52, every B-1, every B-2 is going to be loaded up with everything they can carry. And we are going to go after Iran with a vengeance in the belief that this time we'll get it right. Now, what most people don't understand is we've already done this for all intents and purposes. I listened to Mike Pence, the former vice president, say, well, we just need to take the gloves off of the armed forces. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. We've already done as much as we can do. But there is this belief, I think, in Trump's head that we can do more. And this time around, we'll get it right. The regime or the government, which I prefer to use, of Iran will collapse. The society will disintegrate. I don't agree with that.
The discussion now shifts from military planning to strategic expectations. MacGregor argues that some decision-makers believed additional military pressure would force political collapse inside Iran. He says that assumption underestimated the country's resilience and misread the likely outcome of escalation.
Doesn't the entire international community, diplomatic community, heads of state, recognize that Iran has stymied the U.S. and Israel and may actually be, and please correct me if you disagree, stronger today than it was a year ago, June of 25, when the bombing started?
I think the answer is yes. Now, when you say stronger than it was, I think it is more effective in its military power because they have been resupplied and they have manufactured new weapons and equipment. They've refined their tactics. There's no question about that. They can defend themselves, and they've demonstrated that they can defend themselves at far less cost than anything we would spend, because we're really not interested in defense. We're building an offensive force posture. It's designed to crush everybody anywhere, anytime that doesn't agree with us or doesn't want to go along with us. So, for a fraction of what we spend, the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese have all built various forms of the military power that you've seen in action. And I think the world understands that. And that's going to remove us from the category of global hegemon. And if you listen to some of the retired generals, they aren't talking as much as they did originally about Israel, even though that's the driving force behind everything. They're now saying that if we don't win this, our position as the global hegemon is at risk. Well, no, they're wrong. It's over. Our hegemony is effectively ending. And they think this is a terrible thing, that if we can't control the world is a danger to us. I don't think the world needs to be controlled by us or anybody else, but that's the minority opinion.
MacGregor expands the conversation beyond Iran itself. He argues that the conflict has influenced how other countries view American power and may accelerate a broader shift toward a more multipolar international system. This is one of the interview's central geopolitical claims.
Back on the petroleum issue, right now, a barrel of oil coming off the ship in port is $140 a barrel. So that's considerably higher than the paper price on Wall Street. Yes, the strategic petroleum reserves are being run down, not just here, but all over the globe. We have halted any exports of fuel because we're going to need all of it here. We're that close to the edge. Our refineries have been operating at full capacity, but we can't afford to supply the whole world. It's just impossible. And of course, stupidly, we and the British and the Germans and French have provided the Ukrainians with long-range missiles and drones that are being used to strike the petroleum refining industry in Russia. I mean, it's just a very dumb idea. By the way, we're also buying Russian oil, so it makes you wonder what the hell we're thinking.
Yeah.
That's part of the issue. The other issue, though, is that economically and financially, our position is very fragile now. We haven't talked a lot about it, but in addition to oil, which is very important, and you're seeing the supply chains adjust and reorient. In other words, people are structuring for the future, which doesn't really include us. We're seen as a menace that's going to undermine or subvert the global structure, the global economic structure. That's one problem. Second problem is our currency. We just shipped, I don't know how many billions of euros from a euro slush fund somewhere inside our government that I'm not familiar with to boost the Japanese financial system, to essentially rescue the yen from destruction. Well, that's a temporary fix, Judge. It's not going to fix the problem in Japan, just as we can't fix many of the problems that we confront right now. Everything is temporary. Everything is a quick fix to get through the next quarter, and that's not going to work. And then finally, we have these people in the White House that surround President Trump and others on the Hill that I'm sure are part of this, who have benefited enormously from shorting oil through the series of ups and downs that President Trump has taken us in the oil markets. I think that too is coming to an end. I think we're not going to be able to manipulate the markets in the future the way we have to this point. Reality is going to strike home.
The focus now moves from military strategy to economic consequences. MacGregor argues that energy markets, industrial production, and financial pressures are becoming increasingly connected. His warning is that long-term economic strain could become as significant as the conflict itself.
Is it true that the Iranians have severely damaged or totally destroyed 17 U.S. bases in the Gulf, and much of our assets have been moved to Israel over the complaint of Prime Minister Netanyahu?
I didn't know that he was complaining. That's interesting, because I would think he would welcome that, because they then become targets in Israel. And that promises to bind us ever more closely to Israel and his destiny. So I'm a little surprised at that. The answer is, of course, yes. Look, what has happened is very simple. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, all of these places, Saudi Arabia, they've all come to the same conclusion. We cannot protect them. And if your hegemonic military power proves unequal to the task of protecting them, then it's time for the hegemonic military power to get the hell out. And I think what they're going to do is tell us to go. And indeed, we should, because the longer we remain, the more often they become targets. And remember, Iran has made it crystal clear that if we resume the attacks on them and do the things that President Trump has threatened he will do with the weapons at hand, that they will annihilate, destroy, remove, whatever you want to use for a word, the remaining oil infrastructure in the Gulf region and Saudi Arabia. You have the Houthis that are now making life very, very interesting in the Red Sea for the Saudis. I see no end in sight for that. So the point is that things will not go back to normal whenever this ends. In fact, things will be much bleaker. The world will have to adapt to a very different world. And by the way, once it's made clear to us that we've got to get out, there's only one power on the planet left that can actually finance the restoration or rebuilding of all that infrastructure: China.
Here, MacGregor argues that regional relationships are changing in ways that could outlast the fighting. He suggests countries in the Gulf may reassess their security partnerships, while China could gain influence through future reconstruction and economic investment.
What we're doing in the Middle East has nothing to do with the United States and its core strategic interests. It's a lot of nonsense. I mean, you could listen to Laura Loomer and Levin and other people rant and rage and, pour buckets of filth and abuse all over you because you simply don't think that what we're doing makes any sense for the American people. But I think most people in uniform are increasingly of that opinion. There's not much doubt. Grinkiewicz is obviously speaking volumes. And this all goes back to the core problem, Judge. You brought in this man, General Kane, and I don't know him personally. Seems like a nice guy. But beyond that, he was obviously brought in. He was promoted because they were going to attack Iran. They wanted someone there who would say, yes, sir, it can be done. He was an airman. No one in the Air Force wants to admit for a second that air power is not the dominant force in the globe. In fact, the Air Force has been arguing for decades, you really don't need anybody else. We can do it all. So they got what they wanted. And people keep trying to say, well, General Kane, he did say there were limits to air power. Now, come on, wake up, smell the coffee. Attacking Iran made no sense. We had no chance of subduing that country exclusively with air and missile power. Our sanctions failed. Our diplomacy, our diplomatic attempts to undermine, isolate Iran have failed. And we have created an alliance between Russia, Iran, and China. That alliance was identified by none other than Zbigniew Brzezinski back in the mid-90s. And he said that if that should emerge, if that should arise, our position on the Eurasian continent was at serious risk. In other words, we can't prevail against that. And that's what's happened. That's why this war, which began on behalf of Israel, to make sure that Israel was safe again and would be more than safe, would be the dominant power in the region, and that their interests of their friends in the United States would be well served in the financial markets. All of that has now had a terrible impact on us strategically, because in addition to identifying us as you started out with to some extent, as kind of a paper tiger after all this time, because we have the wrong instruments for the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time, we have now seen this alliance emerge, and this alliance is backed by hundreds of other states and organizations around the globe, all of whom are sick to death of us, are bullying through the financial system, through the IMF, through the World Bank, and want to see an end to this undesirable American financial and military hegemony.
MacGregor ends with his broadest conclusion. He argues that the conflict may have strengthened strategic cooperation among countries such as Russia, Iran, and China, while weakening America's global influence. Whether history supports that assessment remains to be seen, but he believes the long-term geopolitical effects could prove more significant than the war itself. Throughout this interview, Douglas MacGregor presents a consistent argument that the greatest impact of the Iran conflict may not be measured by territory gained or lost, but by how it changed global perceptions of military power, economic stability, and international alliances. Whether viewers agree with his conclusions or not, his central message is clear. The decisions made today could shape the geopolitical landscape for years to come.